So welcome everyone. My name is Lindsay Craig. I'm the president of National Review Institute, the nonprofit parent organization to National Review, established to support and promote the NR mission. So we are very pleased to host this forum today because this has been an amazing collaboration. Despite all the uncertain economic times that we are living in right now, and it seems that we're thrown a loop every week, it seems, NRI is really determined to stick with our strategic growth goals for this project and others that we had established around this time last year. Actually, what's really interesting about this project is that its relevance and importance is actually more relevant and important today than when we first were thinking up this program a little over a year ago. So in the same spirit that led Bill Buckley to found National Review, National Review Institute is really pleased to be collaborating on this new project to explain, defend, and celebrate capitalism. With so much misinformation and misunderstanding of capitalism and market economics today, National Review Capital Matters, this new section on nationalreview.com, through articles, commentary, forums, and conferences, we will elevate the voices and amplify the message of those who defend economic liberty. The project has been up and running now since July, and we're really thrilled to be able to have published a series of really phenomenal writers. Today, you're going to hear from one of those phenomenal writers, well, actually two, I guess, featuring today Kevin Hassett and our editor, Andrew Stuttaford. They're going to have a conversation about Kevin's new paper. We've also been doing other forums over the summer, but what we're really excited to do is to start to have some in-person forums, which we plan to do very shortly later this fall, and then hopefully through the winter. So keep your eye out for invitations for local events that we're going to be having, in addition to continuing to have these kind of Zoom calls. So without further ado, enough from me. I'm really thrilled to hand this over to Andrew so that he can get the program started.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you for all of you for showing up, so to speak, virtually on a Monday morning. I cannot guarantee that this will be a cheerful event, but Monday morning is not necessarily the time for the happiest of conversations. We are, of course, thrilled to have Kevin, who is the co-author of this report that he will be discussing today, and then I will be asking him some questions about it, and then there will be room at the end of it. He'll talk for sort of 15 minutes or so. He and I will chat for about 15 minutes, and then there will be room for questions. And I think something will come up in your screens saying with an email address to which you can send questions that you wish to ask if you do. Again, we'll have about 15 minutes or so for that. Kevin himself, and I would strongly recommend, I mean, we'll only, of course, have a chance to discuss his work a little bit today. And he's already written one thing last week on Capital Matters about this. And so there's something up today on the energy policy, and there'll be a couple more running this week. But nevertheless, I would recommend that everyone does their homework and read the full report. It is really extraordinarily interesting and very detailed, and a serious bit of work. As you'd expect, Kevin is our senior advisor here at National Review Capital Matters. Goodness me, where to begin with the resume? Distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute, vice president of the Lindsay Group, but he most perhaps relevant in this, a distinguished economist, of course, with the Fed for many years, academic, but also served as the 29th chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, beginning in 2017, and then later on left, and then later on rejoined the White House as senior advisor to the president. So he is definitely the man to be listening to on this. And without more ado, I hand the floor to Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for coming. I see lots of familiar names and friends in the attendee list, and looking forward to a lively conversation at the end. I think that one of the things that's been striking about this campaign season, and this is someone who I've been involved in one way or another in presidential campaigns all the way back to pre-2000 when I was one of the main advisors for John McCain, is that campaigns have always attracted me as an academic economist and a policy wonk, because campaigns are kind of where policy is formulated that ends up becoming law. If you look at the history of big policy changes in the US, it's almost universally true, but extremely common at the very least, that some candidate runs for president with a platform that says we ought to do this, we ought to do that. And then if they're elected, they think they have a mandate to do this or that. And very often, if the president wins the White House, then his party captures Congress, and so they can actually make a lot of progress in that. And so you could think back to the new Democrat Bill Clinton, that he had a tax platform that was extremely moderate, even included business tax cuts. He argued that the Democratic Party needed to pursue a new direction, and then he pursued that direction, and really quite successfully for the country. If you go back and look at how strong the economy was during the 8 years of that sort of moderate president, and then we moved forward more recently. President Bush ran on the Bush tax cuts, and it's interesting in terms of historians, if you went back and looked at the campaign documents that the Bush campaign produced to support the Bush tax cuts, they were very detailed, had careful scoring, analysis of distribution tables, and so on. And then when President Bush took the White House, that he took that plan that they had and he basically pushed it up to Congress. And you might remember he said no cherry picking. That he wanted the thing that he ran on to become law, and it pretty much did, with very few modifications. And then right after that happened, then the Bush tax cuts became kind of, I guess, the target of Democratic opponents for a long time. I can remember once I was speaking at a Brookings conference during the Democratic primaries in 2004. And I noted that every single candidate, their tax platform was to repeal the Bush tax cuts. And it kind of, for me, like it still puzzles me about that, in the sense that if, Andrew, if you were running for president, then you would presumably do so because you believe that you knew what's the right thing to do for the country. And you have a very strong belief about it. So you're willing to take the big risk and everything of going out and running for president. And it's just kind of obvious that there's no economic model that says that the bliss point for tax policy is exactly what it was the moment before President Bush took office, right? And so it's kind of odd that there wasn't one person that had a tax idea that was different than just repeal the thing. But then sure enough, President Obama took the White House. And interestingly, because we were in the middle of the Great Recession, he decided to defer the thing that he ran on. So he definitely ran on how awful the Bush tax cuts are and they're a giveaway to the rich and so on, the normal rhetoric. But he postponed the elimination of the Bush tax cuts, or the repeal, until the economy was a little bit stronger than it was when he took over. And so against that backdrop, if you look at the election this time, and that's really what we at Capital Matters are meant to do, is to think about, like the technical aspects of policy and so on. And you said it's not necessarily going to be cheerful, Andrew, but let me say that people often joke that economics is the dismal science, and my response to that is that it's just completely not true. It's not a science at all. But I mean, I think that if you look, that this campaign has paid sort of strikingly little attention to the policy proposals of the candidates, and to compliment and commend the Biden team. That if you actually go to their website or look at the Unity platform, if you look at the policy work that they did over the summer, there's an enormous amount of rich detail about what Vice President Biden might intend to do. and the details spread across tax policy, regulatory policy, health policy, and energy policy. And so my co-authors, Tim Fitzgerald and Cody Callan and Casey Mulligan and I, decided to do something a little bit different from what economists normally do, where you would get like a tax economist to study the tax policy and a regulatory economist to study the regulatory policy. And we studied it kind of all together and put it into a giant macroeconomic model and tried to estimate the impact of the Biden plan if it were to become law. And for those of you who are listening, if you go to hoover.org, the last I checked, then right there on the front page, you can still see a link to the paper. And so you know, what has Vice President Biden proposed? Well, in the tax space, he wants to, and I actually commend them in another regard, that they have a whole bunch of ideas that aren't just the repeal of everything that Trump did. The idea that you should erase the policy of your predecessor is something that I've alluded to in tax seminars as sort of the policy of hatred. So rather, you know, you just hate the other guy, and so whatever he did, you want to erase from the face of the earth. And the Biden team hasn't really done that, in the sense that they've reversed course for some of the things that the Trump administration accomplished, but they've also put forward a whole bunch of different and new policy ideas as well. And so in the tax space, and excuse me for looking aside because I have a list of these I want to make, just let people know. So the tax space, they want to increase the corporate rate to 28%. There's this weird thing, the GILTI tax, which is, you know, meant to, you know, make sure multinationals are paying enough tax, even if they're occupying a tax haven, and it raises the GILTI tax rate up to 28%. It allows the expensing to expire as it's currently scheduled to do. It returns the tax rates to where they were before, the top marginal tax rate where it was before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed. That's 39.6. They bring back the phasing out of itemized deductions for taxable income over 400,000. That adds about 1.5% to the marginal tax rate. So if you're, you know, basically earn an extra dollar, then you lose you know, 1.5 cents of your itemized deductions. They want to cap itemized deductions at 20% of their value, phase out the qualified business deduction, tax capital gains at a top rate of 39.6 for wealthy individuals, extend the earned income tax credit to those over age 65. And apply a 12.4% payroll tax, a Social Security tax, to incomes above 400. You know, right now, if you're a person with pass-through income, then you might have noticed that you're paying that Medicare tax, but not the Social Security tax. And so they're basically removing that cap for that too. Interestingly, they want to eliminate the deductibility of IRA and Keogh contributions and replace it with just a credit that has a fixed value that's a lower amount. And they also want to just let everything that expires in TICSA, let it go ahead and expire. And so that's the tax policy. And in our paper, what we do is we sort of try to aggregate all of those things into sort of summary statistics that tell you exactly what's going on. And the main, I guess, takeaway is that the tax on capital income is going up by a really enormous amount. The marginal total tax rate is going up by about a multiple of 3. And so it's a very, very big tax hike on capital income. And it has potentially, and we go into this in detail in the paper, much bigger effects than you might think when you hear supporters of the Biden tax proposal say, oh, well, like the Social Security tax, that only affects, you know, a few tax returns, you know, and so therefore it can't have that big an economic effect. Well, the Social Security tax increase affects firms, pass-through firms that employ, you know, millions and millions of Americans. And in the paper, we have a table that talks about that. But precisely now, when we're still struggling with the COVID pandemic recession, if you were to take pass-through entities, small businesses, and hit them with a tax increase where their marginal tax rate goes from 37 to 39.6, they lose their itemized deduction. That adds 1.5%. And then you add 12.4% because of the Social Security tax, then you're looking at just a humongous tax increase for employers of maybe about 50 million people. On the regulatory side, I think that there are a whole bunch of nuanced things that we go into in the paper that they propose repealing. They want to reinstate the CFPB regulations that the Trump administration rolled back, and we attempt to quantify those using some methods that we developed, Casey and I, when we were at the Council of Economic Advisors. In the health insurance space, then basically there's two ways to think about the health proposal. One is that there's a public option, and it could be that the public option is not very attractive for people. We don't know what it looks like, how much it costs, and how much it covers, and whether doctors are going to accept it. If the public option is attractive for people and lots of people switch to the public option, then the way to think about the effect is that your employer, instead of giving you health insurance with pre-tax dollars, is going to just give you money. And then you're going to pay for your public option with the money that's going to be taxable. And the premium rate that you're going to pay is 8.5% of your income. And so you're taking health insurance, which at the margin is probably an incentive to work, and turning it into a disincentive to work with a marginal tax rate increase of 8.5%. And that's if everybody wants to do the public option. If instead people want to stay on their silver plan or go to a gold benchmark in the Affordable Care Act, then they get a subsidy if they take an Obamacare policy, but they can lose the subsidy if they work more or earn more. And that creates a higher marginal tax rate there that Casey Mulligan has written a number of papers about. In the energy space, and this is right at the end of my remarks, in the energy space, what Vice President Biden has proposed is basically first to essentially move to an all-electric fleet, so that we have electric vehicles pretty much instead of internal combustion engines. And the all-electric fleet would, we estimate, increase the demand for power consumption in the US by 25%. And at the same time, they want to end the consumption of fossil fuels, but about 70% of electricity in the US is generated right now with fossil fuels. And so at the same time that we have to increase power production by 25% to move the miles from gasoline to electricity, and that 25%, by the way, is about how much electricity generation in the US increased since 1979, when we had the natural gas revolution and stuff. So it's a heavy lift to add 25% to power generation. They're also taking 70% of current capacity offline, which means that you're almost having to reproduce the entire current capacity of the US, given their plan. Needless to say, when we dig into the energy economics of that, we find that it's pretty disruptive and costly. And if, for example, to put it in perspective, we wanted to use solar panels to generate that much power, then you'd have to cover, a big chunk of New England, definitely Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut completely with solar panels, to put it in perspective. And so, I commend the Biden team for actually putting a lot of details on paper, for spelling out what they intend to do. I think that I commend them for not just trying to erase the previous guy, but to think creatively about what they want to do. But I don't think that I would support many of those policy proposals, and if Vice President Biden, does win and they pursue them next year, I'm sure that at National Review and a lot of other places, we're going to be talking a lot about those policies. So back to you, Andrew.
And I hope I have successfully unmuted. It's always the problem. Well, Kevin, let's just start at the beginning. And thank you for that. You mentioned how some of the Obama tax increases were postponed because there he took office in the middle of the great financial crisis, and that was not the time that was the time to be very careful about increasing taxes. Now, as you say, the Biden plan is extremely detailed, and so is your analysis of it. However, there's one thing, when you write down a great list of what you want to do, A, B, C, and D, and then reality has a way of intruding, and just as maybe with Obama, reality wins the day. To what extent do you feel that what we see that has been proposed will actually, assuming that take the assumption that the Democrats have a sweep in the Senate and House, as well as the presidency, will these things actually be enacted?
Right. Well, I think that looking at the list of people who are participating in the call, there are some political types that know this better than me. But the thing that I could say is that as an economic matter, that we're about to have, a huge third quarter. But it's unlikely that the third quarter recaptures all the ground we lost in the second quarter. And I think that, probably will be 3 to 5% below the level that we were at right before the pandemic recession began. And so that the way I think about the economic challenge going forward is that it's a good deal more grave than people might think, or even markets might think right now, if you look at all the good numbers that are coming through. Because basically what's going to happen is that we're going to end the third quarter and we're going to be, say, a chunk below where we were in January, maybe say 3 to 5%. And if we had just cruised along, there wasn't any COVID, and then all of a sudden we had a third quarter drop us 5% relative to the second quarter, we'd be worried about a really deep and long-lasting recession, because firms would look out and say, geez, GDP is 5% lower. I've got too many workers. I've got too much capacity. I need to start laying more people off. And so I think that there is a risk that this recovery is sort of, could run out of steam really fast, especially if you pursued the wrong policies. And so I think that it's pretty likely that Vice President Biden and the Democrats would pursue a stimulus plan, like the one perhaps that Vice President Biden and President Obama designed for the Great Recession, or more like the thing that Nancy Pelosi has already pushed in the House. But on the tax side, my view is that I think that the party has moved a good deal to the left since President Obama. Remember, he had a supermajority in the Senate, which maybe matters less now with the filibuster potentially being repealed. But he had a supermajority, but he decided to defer the tax hikes because he said a recession's a bad time to hike taxes, and the Democrats played along. I think that it's much less likely, so if you look at the rhetoric about how awful and evil the tax cuts are because they're giving money to the rich and sort of ignoring the dynamic effect of corporate taxes on blue collar wages and so on, that it feels almost like a religious principle of the left now that these tax cuts are evil and must be repealed. And so I could imagine basically Congress passing much of the Biden plan. And, it could be that Vice President Biden is, moderate enough to agree with sort of the judgments of President Obama back in the day that you need to wait for tax hikes if you're in a tricky economic time. But I think that the Congress is probably going to push his hand pretty hard on this and then see what he does. And my guess is that in the end, if I were handicapping it right now, that they'd want to get the tax hikes through, because the first year after a presidential election is when big policy changes happen. And if they don't push them through in the first year, then they might never get them at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Goodness. The next question that I had, your paper is, and I should warn people, there are formulae in this paper, but despite that, it is accessible. But one thing I think maybe perhaps you could expand on a little is you talked about the question of pass-through taxation, and the changes to the rules there. Because one of the arguments in the discussion is, well, is this something that is only the proposed tax changes only going to affect the rich? And that typically, if one looks historically, has never really been the case with tax increases. But very specifically in your paper, you talk about the question about pass-through. You alluded to that in your opening remarks. Could you give us a little bit more detail about what that means for, say, a small business owner?
Yeah. So again, the basic point is that that if you're a pass-through, then your taxes go through your individual income tax return, and so therefore, if you lift the marginal tax rate, then if you're a pass-through that makes more than 400,000, then that tax rate will affect you. And I just pulled up the table, like, so for example, if you run a sole proprietorship, if you run all the numbers accounting for the fact that if you borrow money to buy a machine, you get an interest deduction, you get to expense the machine, and there are all these features of the tax code. That's why we have those equations in the paper, right? Is to balance all those things. But there's something that's called, economists call, it's a term of art, the marginal effective total tax rate, and it's intuitively pretty simple. The idea is just basically if I earn 10%. And then through all layers of taxes, including capital gains and income taxes, but I get my interest deduction and things like that, that after tax I get 5%, then the total tax rate is 50%, because 5 is 50% of 10. And so that under current law, for a sole proprietorship, for example, the total tax rate is about 8.4%. Accounting for all the nuances and details of the tax code. And under the Biden plan, it would increase to 18.7%. And if you go through the different types of organizational form that show up on income taxes, that kind of massive, more than doubling of the tax rate is everywhere. And, frankly, a tax hike of that scale, which is really mostly attributable, by the way, to this Social Security thing coming through. That a tax hike of that scale could be just absolutely devastating for businesses next year. And so then the question goes back to your first question: would they actually be that crazy and do that? And I think there are a lot of sensible people over there working with the vice president, and they'd probably say, well, no, we really can't do this tax hike right now because the economy's too weak. But Congress might force their hand. And finally, again, handicapping that, probably what they'll do if they're worried about short-term stuff is have a stimulus plus a tax hike, and have the tax hike basically phase in. So that if you don't hit businesses with a higher tax rate for 2 or 3 years, then they might argue that by then the economy would be strong enough so that they could afford a tax hike. And a reason to expect that they might think that way is if you go back and look at the extremely optimistic forecasts that the Democratic economists, who will presumably be at least have trained the people working for Biden, made about the Obama stimulus. Remember, we're going to have 5% growth next year, and so on. And so therefore, they'll definitely think the stimulus will have a big positive effect and create an economy that's healthy enough to withstand a tax hike of that scale. But I would disagree with that assessment, as you could guess.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well then moving on. In the obviously, as you should do, in your report or in the analysis, you look carefully at the proposals on the energy side. You have already mentioned the fact that, in a sense, what we're looking at is a complete rearrangement of the entire energy supply industry in the US, in that you are removing, really, I think, if I remember, and I feel like reporting to the professor here, I've probably got the number wrong, but I think 70% of our existing energy sources would be no longer, in the end, would no longer be relevant. Yet we are talking about, or could no longer be used. And yet we are talking about an increase in electricity demand of something like 25% over the period. So basically, there are two sides of the equation. On the one side, you have, we're asking you to produce more electricity, but you can't use the things that you have been using to generate power. Now, one of the things that struck me as someone who's always interested in the states is that, particularly on the folks of the state, that if you say that, well, you can't, you can't use certain resources anymore, these resources will have a value at the moment because you extract them and you get paid for them. If you can no longer use them over a given period of time, those resources, instead of being worth X, are worth X minus, and then ultimately zero. And I had two questions related to that. Perhaps you could just run through, and I know you do in the report, which are some of the states that are going to take quite a hit in terms of, well, you thought you had this under your ground and it was worth this, and then here's the new era, and by 2035 or whatever it may be, it's going to be worth nothing. Firstly, what are the sort of hits that are going to be taken? And what is also the impact on state budgets in states like New Mexico, for example, which are very, and they're not only New Mexico, which are very dependent on, say, the income expected from fracking. So unless I'm wrong, you're going to get a double whammy. First is there is the destruction of value in various states. And then you are probably going to get a problem with sorting out their budget because that revenue is no longer there. Would you comment on the states?
Yeah, that's right. And so for sure, one way to think about it is to just say, well, what is the value of the current mineral wealth for fossil fuels in the US? And then let's assume that goes to zero. Now, it wouldn't go to zero overnight. We'll talk about the phasing in a minute, but just as a mental exercise. And we estimate that in the paper, and we estimate that across the US right now, the mineral wealth is about $5 trillion. And so if you're basically going to say, hey, we have to stop consuming fossil fuels altogether, then it's like taking, a $5 trillion, bank account and setting it to zero. You're just, putting the money in the ground and leaving it there. And let's, in the end, by the way, talk about climate benefits too. I've been a carbon tax advocate since the early 90s, and so I'm not immune to thinking about climate. But the costs that we document are very high, and to put them in perspective, we have a table where we show the mineral wealth by state. And as you mentioned, like I'm not a full-time energy economist, but Tim Fitzgerald, my co-author, is, and I was surprised by some of the numbers that you mentioned in Mexico. That their mineral wealth right now is $265 billion. Pennsylvania, $390 billion. West Virginia, $254 billion. To put those numbers in perspective, that $254 billion for West Virginia is about 4 times their annual GDP. And so if you're going to basically tell West Virginia, hey, you know what, you've got this wealth, but we're setting it to zero, then, the amount of space that you have to make up for them is four times their annual GDP. So it's a very, very big change. And so that's a cost. But then the question is, what's the benefit? And that would depend, of course, and this is, the nub in climate policy, on whether the US becoming a leader in this space causes everybody else to pursue similar policies, carbon emissions to drop a lot. And then, if you take the IPCC's preferred model, you calculate an estimated temperature reduction, and then, Ray Fair at Yale has models that will identify the economic benefit from that reduction and so on. And so my guess is that a number like 5 trillion is going to be hard to get a benefit that large, given the GDP right now in the US is 20 trillion. And so that's the benefit if you get everybody else to do it. But the problem, of course, is that the globe is filled with people who might view a policy like this, where we're basically significantly increasing or decreasing the productivity in our energy sector, which then spreads throughout the economy, as an opportunity to capture market share from the now sort of relatively inefficient US firms. And so that if the US stops consuming fossil fuels, then it could be that just means that others do it because they're so energy dense and they're so efficient. And so that Chinese consumption goes way up while ours goes down, and you don't really have much of a climate effect. And then the final thing about the climate effect, which I think is a serious issue, is that, so suppose that you did think that, the rest of the world was going to play along and pursue a strategy like this, and that by 2035, the 5 trillion in mineral wealth for fossil fuels is going to be worth zero in the US, just say. Then if you're a person who owns the fossil fuels and you recognize that they're sort of ramping into that space, then the natural response that you would have would be to open the spigot up as wide as you can and sell as much as you can before you're not allowed to anymore, which means that the consumption of fossil fuels could radically skyrocket in the near term, which would be exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish in terms of climate change. And so that if you're sort of going to have a big reduction 20 years from now, then the extra CO2 in the atmosphere between now and then could be way higher than current projections.
And actually, in your report, I mean, the point about other people playing along is I think a critical one, especially when one looks, say, at Chinese coal production numbers and their plans going forward. But I think that you also make the point, because the cost benefit analysis is very difficult to do because we don't know how the rest of the world will react, and China and India matter in many senses more than the EU. And you make the point that actually one of the perverse results of this could be that what you will do is decrease the cost of carbon-based fuels for the rest of the world, for those who don't play it along. And thus, well, you don't say so, but thus, to my mind, provide an incentive actually to use more of them.
Right, and the final thing is that carbon emissions in the U.S. have been, dropping rapidly because we've been consuming more and more natural gas, and coal is gradually going away. In a paper that Gib Metcalf, professor at Tufts, he was at Princeton back then when we were working together, that we wrote in the early 90s, we looked at, I think it was a $25, if memory serves me right, a ton carbon tax. And we found that it increased the price of oil and gasoline by about 10%, but it increased the price of coal by 85% because coal emits so much more CO2 when you combust it. And so therefore, this move towards natural gas has actually been a very big positive that's been undercovered in the climate space.
Well, thank you. Now, as the clock is ticking on, I'm looking at some of the questions. So if you see me looking shiftily away, this is only because I'm looking at some of the questions. And one question, I won't mention any names, but a very good a bunch of questions coming through, actually, and it's a shame that we won't have time to cover more than just a couple of them. And I see some familiar names as well, and they know who they are. And I think that what about somebody from, I suspect, California, and I live in Manhattan, is what does the tax plan mean specifically for high tax states like California? And the same would be true of certainly here in Manhattan. Can you give us some sort of indication there, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that that first that you'll get your SALT deduction back, but it'll be phased out is my expectation. It's a nuance that I'd have to dig into the details, but that's my expectation. But I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure they've addressed that specific question. But the fact is that Andrew, who is fortunate and unfortunate enough to live in New York City, and I were talking about whether there might be what economists would call a nonlinear effect to these big tax hikes for people in high tax places. And so if you think about it, let's just say that Andrew's got 37% of his marginal tax rate, and then there's 15% for New York State, so he's right now, say, paying 52%. And then if Biden comes in and lifts it from 39.6 and then pays out of itemized deduction, adds 1.3 more, so that's gets you to about 41, and then he adds the 12.4 for Social Security, that gets you to 53, and then you add the 15 for New York on top of that, then you're looking at a really, really high tax rate, right? It's closing in on 70%. And at that point, maybe there's just going to be, there's already an exodus from high tax places. You can see it out in the data, but this could accelerate it in a way that is profound and historic. And because at some point, and remember that the 70% rate is basically applying to incomes that are say above 400, or depending on what the tax tables end up looking like. That it's a huge share of the income for a person who's a high income doctor in New York City or something like that is going to be paid to the state. And so my expectation is that you would just see a acceleration of the exodus from the high tax blue states because of this. And I guess it's almost sure that that's what's going to happen, because at some point, right, the extra 15% income tax, it really matters when the federal tax is getting higher and higher and higher.
So if anyone would like to buy my apartment, I would be.
I'm afraid if I could short your apartment, I might do that, Andrew. I'm sorry.
I'd be extraordinarily grateful. Let me look on, and here we are. This is somebody who's asked two questions. One, which is just too depressing for someone to New York even to read. Do you see any signs when you look at the Biden proposals of plans for any form of fiscal restraint? I mean, we have, of course, run up a few pennies in debt in the last, really since 2008-9. Do you see any hint of fiscal restraint?
Well, I mean, you could argue that the revenue from the tax hikes is at least the tip of the cap towards fiscal restraint, but there's so many other so again, imagine if we really were given the central planning problem of rebooting 95% of current power generation in the U.S., and then you start to think about the subsidies required to make that happen, and it's the scale of the problem. And then we didn't even talk about the retrofitting of the houses and so on. And so I would guess that it's pretty unlikely that the budget deficit would decline even with the tax hikes, especially if you consider that the stimulus will probably be front loaded and the tax hikes could potentially be back loaded. And so I wrote a paper a long time ago where I looked at the history of deficit reduction, and it tends to happen when there's a divided government. And it's pretty intuitive why. If there's a divided government, then let's say that the Republicans come out and they say, hey, Andrew, vote for me because you deserve to keep more of your money than the 70% that the government's taking right now. Shouldn't you get to keep more of your money? And it's kind of a popular thought that people could keep more of their money. And if you're a Democrat running against that, then you don't really want to say, no, I deserve to take your money as the government. I have more right to it than you do. Instead, you want to say, oh, geez, I understand we want to let people have more of their money, but the deficit, what about the deficit? It's a scary thing, this deficit. We have to worry about that. And, on the other side, a Democrat might have some, proposal for increased social spending and, have like some motivation for it that's extremely sympathetic for any reasonable listener. And then as a response to, an expanded welfare program or something, that it's easier to be concerned about the deficit than to address the specifics of the welfare program. And so it's almost like there's a disarmament, a mutually agreed disarmament to decide to go after the deficit, which happens when the government is divided. But my expectation is that if Vice President Biden wins, that he'll control Congress. And if that happens, then you wouldn't be in the political circumstance for the deficit. There'll be lip service for the deficit. It'll be why people argue for the tax hikes, but it won't really be pursued aggressively until there's a divided government. if history is a guide.
And speaking of that, I think we have time for two more questions. Somebody asked an excellent question. Tax. There's always a static assumption about taxes. Is that as you know, is that if you raise the tax by say capital gains, say you increase the capital gains tax by 30%, then capital gains tax revenues will increase by 30%. And at least I'm not a proper economist. That's very rarely the case. What have you, and I know this is very, very difficult to do, but what, if anything, have you built in the assumption of the revenue model that these higher rate taxes will generate? Because historically, as you know, higher rate taxes never generate what is expected of them.
Yeah, well, I think that to go to that, and this goes to which I didn't spend much time talking about, and as an aside, that we in the paper, which hopefully some folks will find the time to read, that we do a very careful modeling, macroeconomic modeling of all this. And we find that the Biden agenda would reduce GDP per capita by about 8% say by 2030 in the long run. So if you're thinking about what it's going to do to revenue, let's just say revenue is usually about 20% of GDP, then it would reduce it by 8%. As well, if it stays at 20, but since they've got marginal tax rate hikes, then probably the reduction in revenue would be a little smaller than that. But revenue is not going to go up if GDP is dropping by 8%. And I didn't talk a lot about the modeling in our session because it's a pretty technical matter. But also, I think that that people have a really worthy skepticism about, like, well, is it really 8% or is it 3% or is it 9%, or like how precise are these economic models? And that, but on the other hand, I think we all have intuition that if we lift Andrew's tax rate to 70%, then he's going to get hosed when he sells his apartment.
Thank you for your words of comfort there.
You did say it was going to be a sad.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll have our last question, and I'm sorry that we can't do everyone's, and I hope maybe that we can have another session, and Lindsay and the NRI will be able to organize this, because I think there's a lot to discuss. And once again, not to be Kevin Schill, we will have the articles that go through this in a more abbreviated form in the course of this week. But I really would recommend reading the whole report, particularly the first sort of 20-25 pages. It's about 60 pages, I think, but that gives you a pretty clear outline. Somebody asks, how do the Democratic leaders propose to replace fossil fuels, and adds a comment that solar's production cost is higher than its ROI. Would you like just to talk just a little bit about how they intend to fill the gap if you're going to one by one knock out the existing energy supply sources that we have? I don't think I saw a lot of chat about nuclear.
Right.
Can you sort of talk us through what the plan is and how it could work?
Yeah, I think that it's something right now that's highly speculative. There's this hope that big subsidies for research will invent new and more efficient clean energy methods that maybe are available, but I'm sort of skeptical that they will be. And so what we do is we take like the frontier alternative energy today, assume that somehow we were able to replace that, and then have to bill people for it. and we find that electric bills would go up for the same amount of electricity by about $1,000 per family.
And I think you say in the note in the report that at the moment the claim is that electricity bills won't go up, but that's certainly not been the experience in the UK, where they've gone up massively. But also you've had Germany's shambolic energy vendor, where you've managed to achieve an astonishing trifecta of higher energy costs plus more reliance on coal. So you think there's a lot of gaps to be filled in there, shall we say, as to how this energy is going to be supplied?
Right, which you could argue again that going back to the question that's on everybody's mind, looking at some of the questions rolling through, that are they really going to do this? That at some point, and it's the final thing that we talk a little bit about, that like if you're going to have electric cars, then Teslas are great cars, but they're expensive. And so we estimate that basically the average car in the US has to cost $12,000 more to sort of meet their fuel economy standards. And so just like, are they really going to do that? If there isn't like some, magical invention that makes alternative energy production extremely more efficient, then would they really ban fossil fuels? Carbon sequestration is an alternative. Maybe that's what's going to happen. I think that there probably are a lot of paths that we could go down, and in the energy space it seems pretty unlikely that, and I guess that's really right when I say that you're basically talking 95% of current capacity, and the 25% they need to increase to move us all to electric cars is exactly how much we've increased since 1979 our power production, which was a time when we got all this natural gas from out of nowhere pretty much. It does seem like the energy proposal is something that's pretty implausible.
Particularly also, I mean, you mentioned that the sheer scale, if they went full solar, I can't remember which unfortunate states are going to be completely covered with, because one of the things, and you've already seen this, as I know you know, that there are already environmental battles over the installation of these sort of facilities, which is going to complicate things still further. But anyway, I think for now, Kevin, I don't know whether Lindsay is going to I've forgotten, is whether Lindsay is going to step in and wrap up. But I would like to thank you very, very much
and thanks everybody for coming.
And for the work that your team has done. And to repeat myself, please do read what the articles we'll be publishing this week. And but also take the time to look at the full report, because it's a grim read, but it's a very interesting read.